Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the third module of our webinar series on leading large-scale change. My name is Ian Smith. I'm Programme Lead for Improvement Methodology with NHS England's Sustainable Improvement Team. I have the role of MC and host for today's webinar series. I'm also working with other colleagues from the Sustainable Improvement Team today, including our very own Rachel Gray, who will be looking after things, all things technical. Please do get in touch with Rachel via the chat box if you need any help or support. You can find the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. If you can't see the chat box there is an icon on the top right of the screen labeled chat. If you click that, the chat box should pop up. Rachel's the place to go should you need any help. And joining me today for this session are my colleagues Elaine Bayliss and Michael Anderson. Excuse me. Elaine is a nurse and experienced large-scale change manager. She has applied the change model principles that we look at today to national programmes, including end-of-life care and the formation of the Wheelchair Leadership Alliance, which ran the Right Chair, Right Time, Right Now campaign with Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson. And Michael is an experienced improvement program manager. He's used change model principles to implement lean improvement methods in acute mental health community and commissioning organisations. So today, Elaine and Michael will lead the session. They're going to be introducing to us change models to help us to understand the change process, as well as some practical ways in which change can be facilitated. Rachel will be helping me to monitor the chat box, so please do feel free to use that. Rachel will also be supporting some of the interactive sections of the webinar. So without further ado, I will hand over to Michael to get things underway. Mr. Anderson, take us forward, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the third session in this webinar series. We're at the halfway point now, so it's feeling good. I was going to say it's like the Wednesday of the sessions, but that's a bit of a down. Every session is like a Saturday evening. So today's session focuses on the process of change and the change model. So what are the objectives of today and what can you hope to get out of it? So basically we're going to be describing the key stages experienced by people in the process of change. We're going to be identifying our preferences in relation to the components of the change model. We're going to be describing where the change model came from, the background to it, and the core elements of it. And we're going to identify where there are opportunities to strengthen our approach to change. As we're at the halfway point, I just wanted to go back over some of the different ways you can interact with us during these sessions and just have a quick recap on some of them. So we've got feedback icons. These can be accessed from the bottom right of the participant screen on the right-hand side of your page. And you can either raise your hand if you need attention for anything or you want to speak, or you can press the megaphone for your feedback icons. So we just take a second out for you all to give me a green tick. That would be great. Or applaud me, whatever you want to do, that's completely fine. Probably a lot of red ticks will come up now for that, but that's fine. Great, thank you. Can see ticks coming in. Also, we're going to be encouraging you, as always, to use the chat box as much as possible. The amount of interaction we've had on that through the other sessions has been incredible, and it's brilliant to see people chatting, talking, interacting, answering each other's questions. It's a really good community growing that we've got there. And then we've also got the annotation tools. So we're going to be using the annotation tools again. You can find them in the top left-hand corner of your screen under where it says Quick Start. There's a little pen. Click on that, and you get the drop-down box. The top arrow is going to be what we're going to be using to place a little pointer on things today. So we're going to give that a test. If you joined us for our induction webinar, you will remember this slide. If you could pop up to that annotation tool on the left-hand side of the screen, and yeah, perfect. Thank you, Rob, Gabrielle. If you are coming from the UK and Ireland, please use the map on the right-hand side as it's a lot bigger and we can see actually where you're coming from in the country. Otherwise, we just get a lot of arrows in the middle there. Great, I'll give you a second to do that. Just a mental note for us there. I think we need to make that map a little bit bigger even still, because I'm finding it hard to pinpoint exactly where people are from. But you're using the tool, which is the point. So that's brilliant. Okay, excellent. I think we'll move on. So hopefully A few of you will recognize this slide from earlier in the series. This is our organizing framework for improvement and transformation. It brings together leading large-scale change and the change model to provide a generic structure for planning and delivering change. Having focused so far on leading large-scale change in the first two webinars, we're now going to be looking at the second dimension, which is the change model and the process of change. So this is the process of change by Prochaska, De Clemente, and Norcross, and it shows the 5 different stages, of which we're going to go into in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So the first stage is pre-contemplation, and at this stage people don't really intend to take any action in the foreseeable future, so the next 6 months. And that could be because they're uninformed, they're underinformed about what's going on in the organization, or they've attempted something, it's failed, and they've become demoralized. All of those factors can contribute to somebody feeling like they're in this stage. The next stage is contemplation, which is people who intend to change in the next 6 months. And although they can see the pros of changing, they can also see the cons of having to do something and taking that leap. So it's difficult for them to do it, and it's quite easy for them to put it off. Then we've got preparation, which is people who intend to take action in the next month. Typically, they've already done some action, some planning, some setup, and these are the people that are really good to get hold of when you're starting to set on your change journey, as they're people that want to do things, they're action-orientated. Then you've got action, which is people who have made specific overt modifications to the way that they work, and they're doing something which will ensure change, so that they're the doers, basically. And then finally, you've got maintenance, which is working to prevent a relapse or going back to old ways of working. So this is all about having that sustainability of change and making sure you have things in the right place to make sure it can be carried on, it doesn't revert back. So I'm aware that I'm talking at you a lot, so we're going to get you involved now. So there are many, many different change models out there, and we'd like to know from you. Oh, never mind. I think that was somebody coming in there, but never mind. So we recognize that there's many different change models out there. So we'd like to run a poll, please, Rachel, if you could press the magic button, that would be great. And we'd like you to tell us what type of change model you use the most in your improvement efforts. We'd love you to use the poll, and we'd love you to interact in the chat box. Put anything in there that you think hasn't been covered, or any comments you have, or any conversation starters. That would be brilliant. Just give you a few minutes for that. Okay, 30 seconds. It's going to feel like a long 30 seconds, that, Rachel. I might have to minimize that down to 10. Yeah, good point, Elaine. Thank you. You can select multiple ones. You don't have to just select one. If you use several different change models, please put them on there. Okay, great. So we can see a lot of people using the model for improvement from the IHI. A few people using the change model, which is good. 8-step process. So there's a wide spread there, which is brilliant. Okay, and we'll come back to cover some of this stuff a little bit later on, as we're going to try and interact with you guys as much as possible throughout this session when we move into Elaine going through the change model. So, having introduced the process of change and looked at different types of models, we want to introduce you to the change model as an approach to making change happen. It was originally developed in 2012, and it's based on research, theory, and practical experience from hundreds of senior leaders, clinicians, commissioners, providers, and improvement activists who all got involved to create this model. It was reviewed in 2015-16, and I'm happy to say that it will be refreshed and released by the end of this year. And we're actually going to give you guys a sneak peek at one or two of the tools that we're going to be releasing on that during this webinar on the network space. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to now hand over to Elaine, my colleague, and she's going to talk to you about what the change model is.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Michael, and hello again, everybody. It's great to be joining you today as a guest speaker this time, in place of being your usual facilitator. So, what is the change model? Well, the change model is really a way of thinking constructively about our rounded approach to change. And it's rather more of a philosophy, I guess, rather than a methodology. So the model itself, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, is made up of 8 component elements or parts. And these give us a really helpful organising framework for sustainable and transformational change. If we can use a change model, it can help us to improve the potential success of our change programmes and the benefits that they could yield for our stakeholders, and the patients and the families that we're trying to support with our change programmes. So the model then is a really uncomplicated framework that helps us to consider all of the key elements that can help make change happen, and it also helps us to think about who needs to be involved in the change. So how does it work? Well, if we look at the model that you can see on your screens now, you can see there are 8 component parts, but the starting point of the model is always about understanding and articulating our shared purpose. This helps to define and connect people with what needs to be achieved and why. And we'll pick up a little bit more on shared purpose as we go through this presentation. After starting with defining and building our shared purpose, all of the components that you can see around the edge of the model can be addressed in any order. But the important thing to consider is that all of them need to be looked at in more or less equal measure, and they all need to be aligned to our shared purpose. So let's just go back to our shared purpose for a minute and just break that down a little bit more, because this is a really important starting point. As I just mentioned, our starting point always has to focus on what is our shared purpose. If transformational change is going to occur and sustain, we need to start moving beyond our individual purpose of why we do what we do towards a more collective vision of, and to coin the phrase from Ali from her webinar last week, a fundamentally new future state. If we can define what our shared vision is, we can start to bring all of our people and our values together behind a common goal or a purpose for change. So it's about creating that new vision for the future. So there's some key questions to ask ourselves then when we're looking at our shared purpose. And for me, they kind of can be grouped in these 3 questions. What really matters to us? Why are we doing what we do? And why should we care? If we can answer these questions, we can really start to focus attention on why the proposed change should become more personally important to the people that you need on board to help deliver or champion that change. And it will start to help us to really understand and articulate why this solution rather than any other. So the R then is very much about identifying who are our people, who will affect the change, who will define the benefits, and who will make that change happen. The shared element is very much about building depth and breadth to our vision and starting to identify and agree the ambitions and drives for change that we have in common. This can help to move us from our individual to shared values. The final element, purpose, is very much about making it really clear why it matters, and we'll come back to that a lot more later on. I'll also pick up more on shared purpose through a large-scale programme example that I'll share with you a little while that I was involved with. You can also find out a lot more about building shared purpose in our Leading Large-Scale Change Guide if you haven't looked at it already. And I've done a little bit of mapping back to the guide for you as we go through various elements of the change model in today's session. So you can pick up more on shared purpose through page 46 onwards. We'll also be dedicating next week's webinar to a whole hour of looking at how do you build your personal narrative and how do you create that shared purpose. So if you haven't registered for that session, we'll pop the link in the chat box for you, and we'll also share it for you on the Virtual Academy Network site so you can register through there. So what about the rest of the change model? Well, what I'd like to do for the remainder of this middle section of today's session is to walk together through the different components of the change model and explore together what it is that we might need to pay attention to in each area. Now, we craftily put the little poll at the beginning of this webinar so we could kind of see how many of you already have some good knowledge or are using the change model in practice. So with your permission, I'd like to flip things a little bit as we go through this middle section. What would be great is if we could draw on the wisdom of the crowd joining us today and to share how you are using the change model elements in practice and what some of your successes and challenges might be around deploying those different approaches. So we'll do that whenever time permits. We'll then pause on each component and we'll explore together what we're paying attention to, and I'll share with you an example tool, approach or framework that we think it might be useful for you to consider for that component that we highlight within our soon to be published change model guide. So does that sound okay, everybody? Hope everybody's up for that. Okay, great. I think there's lots of chat going on. Right, so to make this a little bit more random and fun, and with big thanks to Michael for the animation that's about to hit our screens, we're going to try out the change model Wheel of Fortune. Okay, so let's see which element we're going to drop on first. Okay, so this time we've landed on leadership by all. So this component very much asks us to consider and address the question, do our leaders have the skills to create transformational change? And I'd love to get your insights and thoughts on this in the chat box. So if you're using the change model and you have something to share, could you please pop in the chat box, what type of leaders do you think we need to lead transformational change? Or what methods, tools or frameworks do you use to help develop desired leadership traits and attributes? I'll just give you a couple of seconds to put some suggestions in the chat box around that before we move on. There's one or two comments starting to come through. Okay, Michael, I'm just going to come to you for a moment. So what are people saying in terms of leadership by all?
Yeah, saying that it needs to be leaders and enablers, not managers. About collaboration, need to be visible, is coming up a lot. Visionaries, charismatic leaders. So there's a lot coming out about people need to be leaders rather than sort of traditional managers as such.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I love the comment that just came through about us needing to be adaptive leaders. That's so pertinent. So that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. And please do keep those comments coming into the chat box. We'll share all of that back with you after the session. So as many of you have picked up, and you'll carry on saying in the chat box now, leadership by all is absolutely about the ability to create and articulate a clear vision of change. But it's also much more than that. It's very much about distributed leadership and finding your leaders at all levels of the system, not just those who might have a leadership role in hierarchical structures. And these natural leaders need to be able to very much role model transformational change behaviours and have the practical skills to advance change and be able to identify what additional help and support might be needed and when. So one of the resources that we found really helpful around this leadership by all component is the Leadership Academy's 9 Dimensions of Healthcare Leadership model. This model helps to describe how you can develop as a leader, very much independent of your hierarchical role, and it gives you also a free self-assessment tool and a 360 feedback tool that can help you to understand much more about your leadership strengths and your areas for development. And there's more about this in our change model guide as soon as that's published. If you'd like to explore more about leadership by all, and there's lots and lots about leadership in our large scale change guide. And also, if you weren't able to join us live for the first 2 webinars in this series, both Debbie Sorkin and Ali Wheeler in their sessions on leadership and leading large-scale change cover this subject off in much more detail. Okay, so let's go back to our Wheel of Fortune again, see which segment we're going to pick up this time. Okay, so this time we're on Motivate and Mobilise, and this is very much about thinking, how can we be sure that we're engaging and mobilising the right people? So Motivate and Mobilise is absolutely about identifying who needs to be involved, understanding who our stakeholders are, and framing and reframing our messages, as Ali and Debbie very strongly outlined in the first 2 webinars of this series. It's also about developing engaging stories to get people on board with your change programs and the progress that needs to be made. So one of the resources that we reference in the Change Model Guide that you might also find helpful is the Energies for Change model and the short animation video that was developed by the NHS Institute for Innovation and Improvement back in 2013. This helps you to think about how could you create the right environment to support your change efforts. And of course, there's also lots more about motivation and mobilisation in the Large Scale Change Guide, and we'll cover this off in great detail in next week's mobilisation webinar. Okay, and I think Rachel's just popped the link in the chat box for you if you'd like to have a look at that video. So let's move on again and see where our little Wheel of Fortune is going to take us this time. Okay, so now we're going to land on improvement tools. We'd like to get interactive with you again now because it'll be interesting to learn about you all on this one. So could I invite you to share with us what improvement tools that you found most helpful to support your successful transformation programs? And again, I'll give you just a few seconds to pop some thoughts into the chat box. Let's take a few minutes to little think about it here. Yeah, ideas are starting to come through now. Okay, so Michael, I'm just going to come to you again in terms of what's being picked up here.
Yeah, we've got root cause analysis. We've got a couple of mentions of the IHI model, PDSA cycles, process mapping, driver diagrams, RACI charts, fishbone diagrams, root cause analysis. So yeah, there's a wide spread of tools out there that people are using.
That's absolutely fantastic, and lots of the excellent improvement tools that we would hope to have seen in the chat box just, so that's absolutely super. And it'd be great if people wanted to carry on a conversation about some of those in the Virtual Academy network space afterward about what's working really well for them and maybe what some of the challenges are that you've overcome with them. So thank you, that's really great sharing. We share a number of these tools and how to use them in practice with you in the Change Model Guide, which we'll be publishing hopefully sometime in the new year. And we also include the two resources that you can see on your screen now, and I think some of you actually mentioned these in your feedback in the chat box. So one is IHI's Model for Improvement, which I think needs very little introduction, and also alongside it is the original NHS Improvements First Steps Towards Quality Improvement Guide. So please do take a look at those. I think what's important to remember in terms of the change model with improvement tools is that the change model doesn't specify or recommend a particular set of tools that you should use, but rather it stimulates us and our change teams to think about and agree which improvement methods, approaches and tools could we adopt to support our particular circumstances and change programs. So it's more about that thinking process and being clear about what will work for us. You can also learn a lot more about the various improvement tools that we found effective in section 4 of the Large Scale Change Guide, and you'll find that starting on page 77 onward. Okay, so we're going to go again with the little Wheel of Fortune. It's working quite quickly, Michael, which is good news. So this time we're looking at measurement for improvement. And the ask here is, are we measuring the outcome of our change continuously and transparently? So if you've given any thought in your change programs to how you're going to measure the impact of your outcomes and interventions, really interested to hear back from you on that in the chat box. In particular, how are you measuring your changes? What challenges do you have in measuring your improvements? Or how do you even know when your improvement has been impactful? Because that's something we've had lots of feedback on that folk can struggle with. So again, I'm going to give you few seconds to pop something into the chat box around that and see what people are using, and also if you've got any challenges in that particular area. Just love this drawing on the wisdom of the crowd. There's so much expertise amongst everybody on the call today.
Also makes our life quite easy, doesn't it? It's just good.
It does indeed. It'd be very boring for everybody. It was just you and I, Michael. Okay, so what are we getting coming through now, Michael?
We've got SPC charts. We've got some of the challenges are around technology and data access causing problems. Somebody saying baselining and benchmarking is crucial. Measurement is so important. Often reaction to performance processes rather than our SPCs. There's no improvement without measurement. That's true. Yeah, it's just a binge. You don't know if it's an improvement or not. Yeah, there's a lot of different things, logic models, loads of different things coming in from different people.
Super. Yeah, lots of really great feedback there, and I like that about making sure we've got a balanced family of measures. That's just so important, and with improvement we know it can take some time to show the impacts of our interventions, so having that balance of measures is absolutely key, isn't it? So within the change model, the change model component is basically asking us to think about, let me just move the slide on for you guys, what is the best way to measure improvement? Do we have accountability? Do we have benchmarking? So spot on the folks that made those comments in the chat box. How can we identify meaningful and observable outcomes and improvements? And what are the right measures? I think that's a real challenge for many of us, knowing which are the right measures to use, especially when we're showing improvements over time. I think really critically as well is how do we evidence that we have made that difference to our key audiences? So we need to give some thought to what do those audiences need to know, in what format do we need to present that data to them so that they can make sense of what we're showing them. And very often we need a multitude of approaches toward that. So we have a number of approaches that can help you with this within our change model guide, and 2 of them are shared with you on the screens now. They are the A to Z of measurement and also the 7 steps for measurement and improvement that were developed by colleagues within NHSIQ. And if you'd like to know more about these and other measurement approaches, you can find out more in section 4.4 of our large-scale change guide, which starts on page 92. I'd also like to put a big shout out to my lovely impact research and evaluation colleagues within the Sustainable Improvement team. They've done a fantastic piece of work developing an impact framework, and this can really help you to evidence the effect of your change interventions. So if you haven't heard already about the impact framework produced by the SI team, please do get in touch with us via the Virtual Academy network site, and we can let you know more there and connect you with those colleagues. So we'll move on again because time is running away with us already. Okay, project and performance management this time. So the question the change model asks of us here is, do we have an effective approach for delivery of change and the monitoring of progress towards your planned objectives? So the evidence around project and performance management is broad and strong. So in essence, this component of the change model is a reminder to us that whilst we don't need to be completely purist about our project and performance management methodologies, we should absolutely ensure that we've got sound project and performance management disciplines and focus in place. And this will help to give us much better quality control of our change programs and therefore increase the probability of delivering benefits of real importance. If we don't address this component, it's more likely that other elements of the change model might fail. So at its very basic level then, we should ensure that we've got agreed and have adopted some effective project management methodologies that work for our local circumstances. We've agreed with the people that need to be involved what the clear timelines are, what our key milestones are, and what our governance arrangements need to be. We've got clearly identified and articulated objectives, and we have a process in place for capturing and showing the impacts of achieving these objectives. And more information on the change model component, the project elements of change model component are made available in our change model guide. Okay, so let's see where we're going to go this time. Can't be many left now. Aha, system drivers. Okay, so how can we utilise system drivers to help support our change programs? So this component starts to challenge us to think about whether we've aligned our processes, systems and change ambitions to the current system drivers, such as the 5-year forward view, to better help support our change efforts and ensure that they actually are required. Considering system drivers will help us to better identify why our proposed change is necessary, and that can really underpin our case for change. It can also help us to increase stakeholder support if we can align our change efforts to relevant intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. And we give some examples of how you can address this in our change model guide, as you can see illustrated on your screens now. There's also much more on system drivers and on motivating factors in the large-scale change guide, and I would suggest taking a dip into page 65 onward for that particular element. Okay, so we're back to the Wheel of Fortune for one more time. Let's have a look where we're going here. So now we're on to spread and adoption. So I think this is the last of the segments in the change model that we're going to whiz through. So I think I'm going to come back to you again this time just to ask you a question actually and explore with you. How do you plan for the active spread of innovation from the start of your projects? Be really interesting to know what kind of approaches you take to that. Do you plan for spread and adoption from the start? Is it something that you think about part way through your projects, etc.? So again, I'll give you a little opportunity to put some feedback on that into the chat box. Just give you a minute or two to type. I'm impressed that people are managing to type their feedback in without typos. I usually struggle with it. Yeah, some good comments coming through already. Michael, do you want to start sort of synthesising those?
Yeah, so saying using networks to start to engage people early doors, getting out communication through the usual methods of all user emails or blogs. It needs to be planned from the onset, people are saying. Stakeholder mapping, communication plans help with this sort of thing. Communicate, basically.
Yes, and I think that communicate is so key, isn't it, in very many forms with very many different audiences. Fantastic. Please carry those messages coming through in the chat box. That's really helpful to see. I think for us within the spread and adoption component, it's really important to plan for this right from the start of your change programs and thinking about how you might share and spread your change journey learning and your outcomes. And for us, we found that this is most effective if you can do this as your journey unfolds rather than waiting to the very end of your project. It's also great if you can use a variety of channels and media to share your story so that you're reaching out to everybody that you want to touch on. And you might then gather new leaders and new champions that can support you with that change. Really, really key to celebrate your successes, and that's just not the big bang at the end, it's all the little mini successes along that journey that add to the whole at the end. And don't be scared to, as I said, to share those challenges. If you share those challenge stories as you go along the journey, you'll really help other people to avoid some of your pitfalls and help them to be brave, actually, and it will potentially accelerate their transformation efforts. And I think finally for us, it's about remembering to listen to and learn from others. Like we've shown this morning, the wisdom is always in the crowd. It never sits in one small room with a bunch of people on a change program board. So a good resource that we have found helpful in this particular dimension that we feature in our change model guide is IHI's 7 spreadly things. So that's definitely worth looking at. It gives you some advice about pitfalls to avoid around spread and adoption and some things that you can do to address that. And we've also, of course, got much more on spread and adoption within the large-scale change guide, so you can dip in around page 70 to look at one particular option on that. Okay, so we're going to move on from our Wheel of Fortune now, and we're going to now have a little think about how we can bring the change model to life. So in this last section, I thought it might be helpful if I took you through an example of how I've deployed the change model in practice and how we've used it as a diagnostic tool to help identify strengths and weaknesses in a big national transformation programme. We'll then see, we're going to attempt to run a simulation of that exercise on the webinar today to give those of you who haven't used the change model before a chance to see how it might help you with change programs in practice. So let's set the scene a little bit. Back in 2015, I was the programme lead in NHS Improving Quality for the Wheelchair Services Improvement Programme. We'd been brought in by the NHS England Wheelchairs Programme team to assist them to do more to help accelerate the change effort to improve wheelchair services across England. And that was a service that was affecting upward of 1.2 million people. This followed identification that there was a real pressing need for cross-system change to start to address issues with waste, delays and harm, as had been highlighted by very many service users. So in phase 1 of the programme, and bearing the change model components in mind, we examined what the data was telling us about wheelchair services. And this helped us to pull together and publish our e-digest, Right Chair, Right Time, Right Now. That e-digest very much helped us to establish our case for change. We also then facilitated a wheelchair summit, and this brought together a big group of key stakeholders, including very many service users, their carers and families, to agree what else we could do to build shared purpose and help accelerate positive change efforts or motivate and mobilise our people. This led to a number of new initiatives in phase 2 of the programme, and I'll take you through some of those now. So they included the establishment of a National Wheelchair Alliance that we were extremely fortunate to get Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson to chair. And the Alliance brought together key leaders from across service users, carers, charitable sector, providers, commissioners and suppliers to unite behind the improvement effort and to start really building a much stronger shared purpose and champion key changes. We then developed a wheelchair charter, and this outlined what good should look like in effective wheelchair services, and it allowed us to create a really sound vision of the future. Once we got the charter agreed between us and published, we then launched, or created and launched, a massive national mobilisation campaign that was called Right Chair, Right Time, Right Now. And this, the aim of this mobilisation campaign was to really ignite people to support our burning ambition to significantly improve wheelchair services countrywide. That was hugely successful, and we managed to hit the BBC 6 o'clock news, 54 BBC radio stations, The Guardian online, and it just went massive at that point. But despite the success of these interventions, there still wasn't enough for us. And we realised that having significantly raised the profile of wheelchair services and the urgent need to help support them to improve their care delivery, we really wanted to work proactively with a number of wheelchair services around the country to help them accelerate their wheelchair service programme improvement efforts. So from the outset, we used the change model to frame our support offer and to provide us with a diagnostic tool to assess organisations' readiness for change prior to creating 30, 60, 90-day action plans with them to support their transformational programmes. And this approach was especially successful when we used it with 4 CCGs in the north of the country to help them to further develop their wheelchair services transformation plans. And what you can see on the screen now are our change model maps that we use to help us to do this exercise with folk. So we're going to have a little play with the technology and see whether we can have a go at running through that same change model diagnostic exercise now. So what I'd like you to do is to have a think about which element of the change model, which component of the change model do you feel most comfortable addressing, or which one do you relate to the most? And just while you're having a little think about that, let me just explain that we would normally carry out this exercise in a room face-to-face with some key stakeholders who are part of the change team, and we would use the change model maps that you saw on the last slide. But today what we're going to do is to simulate the exercise using the change model image on the screen. And then in place of your feet, we're going to use the arrowhead annotation tool that we used at the start of the webinar, which if you haven't found it already, oh my gosh, keep already going, thank you. You can find under the quick start menu and then click on the arrowhead icon. Fantastic. So we'll carry on letting you just show up on the screen which element are you really most comfortable with. It's a really interesting spread coming up there. Give it a few more seconds. Fantastic, still coming in. And for those of you that have already popped your arrows on the screen, it would be fantastic if you wanted to pop in the chat box why you've chosen that particular segment. Why is that the one that's most comfortable to you? Okay, so we'll pause at that point. And if you haven't put your arrow on yet, still do so. That's not a problem at all. So what is great to see from what everyone said back on that screen at the moment is that there's a real spread of the different elements that people are comfortable with. And you will find that in any change team. There will be usually a bent towards one part of the change model or another in terms of the elements that people are most comfortable with. And that's something for you to think about in terms of how your change teams are approaching your change programme. Right, so we can just pause the arrows for a moment now. I'm just going to move it on one more. And on this one, what I'd like to do is repeat that exercise. But this time, what I'd like you to do is to use your arrow pointers to point at the element that you struggle with the most. Which one do you least relate to? And then we'll have a conversation about what that might be telling us. Oh, this is fascinating because it's starting to look very different to the last image. And again, if you feel able to, please share with us in the chat box why it is that you're feeling that this element is the one that you are least comfortable with. They're still coming in now, which is fantastic. Okay, so people are still just popping the arrows on. While we seem to have more distinct groupings in terms of the elements that people are struggling with more or feel least comfortable with, compared to the last slide where we looked at what people felt happy with There was much more of a rounded grouping on the change model for that one. So unsurprisingly, we've got a gaggle at the bottom. Measurement always seems to rate really highly here. Michael, I'm just going to come to you. What kind of feedback are we getting in the chat box on this?
Yes, we're getting that people have sort of a preferred skill set. So what they're used to doing is obviously their preferred, and then the flip side of that is the thing that's most alien, obviously, is the thing that they're going towards. So people are saying that they struggle with spread and adoption. They find measurement challenging, do not have the necessary data or the technology available, hard to measure the impact of some changes. So I think that's why we've seen the shift from, there was a lot of people in improvement tools feeling comfortable, and there's not many in there now, but a lot of people have made that shift towards the bottom left and the top.
Yeah, and it's really interesting when you conduct this exercise, and thanks Michael by the way, and when you conduct this exercise with the folks in your teams to see where those energies lie. And from what we've just had coming through in the chat box and what we've seen visibly on our screens today, it does give you the opportunity when you conduct this exercise to have a really good understanding of where your strengths and some of your weaknesses might lie in your particular group and who will be leading your change. And it will highlight for you where there might be some areas where you need to invest in making sure that you've got the right approaches in place for that particular component of change. So what we did with the leaders in the north of England was to conduct this exercise with them before we started to help to support them with their change programs in wheelchair services. And they found it really illuminating that the change leaders very much had a bent towards one half of the change model, and it was very much the transactional elements of change. So they were great in terms of understanding the drivers, the project and performance management. There was a little bit on improvement tools that they thought about, but they were much less strong around the building shared purpose, motivating and mobilising, and bringing in the necessary leadership to support that change. And they found it really, although they kind of knew it subconsciously, running through this change math exercise helped them to really bring to the fore why they were struggling with some elements of their change programme, and it helped them to kind of address that. And you can do that in a constructive way, so I'll just move on from that slide now, and this is the next part of what we did with those leaders. So once you've conducted the change map diagnostic exercise, and you can do that face-to-face with a small group, or you can run it virtually like we've managed to do today, it's quite simple to do. You can, as we did with those North of England senior leaders, start to plot the outcomes of those conversations on this change model gap analysis template. And so you can see on your screens now, this very simple template allows you to think about the different elements of the change model, map your strengths in each of those areas in terms of where you are now as a change team, and then in the second graph, plot actually where do you think you need to be in terms of your attention to those particular elements if your change is going to be successful. And that allows you to identify where you need to sort of direct some of your energies. In the particular example that you have on your screen in front of you, you'll say for this one, more energy needs to be paid, more attention needs to be paid towards building shared purpose, motivate and mobilise, measurement and user improvement tools. And once you've got that intelligence, you can then capture that on a action plan template. So we've also provided an action plan template for you to help you to address any of the areas of identified weakness. And both the gap analysis tool and the action plan template that I've just shown you on the screens are available in the change model guide as soon as that's published. But we're going to do a little bit of a cheat, and we're going to share those with you as an early advanced copy on the Virtual Academy Network site. So if you think that these will be helpful to you, then you can actually download those from the Virtual Academy site and use them to support your work now. And within this change model action template, we've also posed some questions for you to ask yourselves in terms of thinking about ways that you can address any of your weak areas. So hopefully that will be quite useful to you. Okay, so we're going to leave a little bit of time for questions this week. So just in summary then, just to think about what we've learned about the change model today and what we've shared with one another. The change model gives you a really systematic way in which your change teams and yourselves can think about all of the critical dimensions that can affect your change programs. It will give you insights into a range of tools and resources that could support the effectiveness of your change programs, and will at least stimulate you to think about what they might be. It contains 8 component elements, the most important of that being starting with shared purpose, but all of them should be considered in equal measure before setting off on your change journeys. And by using the model, you can assess your readiness for change at the start of your change initiative, and that should really help to increase your chances of success. So as a package, it's a way of thinking about change, it's also a diagnostic tool, and it's kind of a mental thought process. Okay, so I think we're going to pause at that point now, Ian, to allow some time for feedback and for questions if folks have anything to come back to us on from the session today.
Yes, indeed we are. Folks, if you have questions, and I hope you do, please do pop them in the chat box. First of all, Ian, I thought that was excellent. I really enjoyed the session as it goes. I hope others did too. Just to say, while you're thinking of your questions, I'm sure that there must be some. If you could pop them in the chat box, that would be great. And if you're feeling brave, we might unmute a few people to get you to ask your questions online. I've got one or two that I grabbed earlier on from the chat. As it was going on live through the session. I've got a question here. Geraldine asked a question about the change model and commented that they would expect to see evaluation or learning as a key component. And the question is that built in or implied in other components rather than an explicit component? Be interested in your thoughts on that, Elaine and Michael.
Yeah, it's Elaine here. Yeah, absolutely critical and spot on. It's really important to make sure that we have that covered off as part of our change programs. And for me, yes, it is absolutely contained within the component elements of the change model. So the measurement component addresses that within that particular sector and ways that you might think about doing that. Also, the learning is captured within the spread and adoption element of the change model. So it doesn't just end in terms of spreading what your change is and who you want to be engaged with it and what the outcomes might be. It's also about the spread and adoption of the journey that you've been on, the spread of your learning. That bit I mentioned earlier about, what was the key challenges along the pathway of the journey that you went on. How did you overcome those barriers? Who else did you need to bring in to help and support you to get over that barrier? That's absolutely critical in terms of spread. So I always think of spread in kind of 2 dimensions. One is about the spread of what I'm trying to achieve from the programme and what the outcomes are aiming to be. And the other bit of spread is how do I help other people who might be on a similar change journey to either replicate some of the things that have gone really well or avoid or get round or overcome some of the things that didn't go so well in my change journey. Michael, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you covered that absolutely perfectly. I couldn't possibly add anything else there, but you're right, it's all integrated in there. It's part of most sections, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah. Okay, Ian, anything else?
Yes, we are getting questions coming through thick and fast now. Very interesting question here from Jane Williams. That's a question. If you've already started a large-scale change and wished you had these sessions first, is it too late to pause and introduce a model? Very good question. So no pressure. We have to help Jane out with this one, guys. So
I think we do, Jane.
What have we got here?
I think that's got to have the award for best question ever asked. I love that question. No, Jane, I don't think it is too late. I think at any point in your change journey, pausing and going, hey guys, let's just stop for a moment and have a think about where we're going next with this and where we've been so far is a really healthy thing to do. And with the wheelchairs programme, we actually had 4 phases to that work. And within each phase, we had no clue what the next phase looked like. So when we pulled phase 1 together and we had the, let's look at the data, I was the editor for the digest, Right Chair, Right Time, Right Now, which was huge amounts of burning midnight oil to get that to pull together in the time frame. And then we had the wheelchair summit. We knew something had to come next in phase 2, but we didn't know what it was. So we paused at the end of that and kind of went to the change model at that point and said, right, what is this suggesting we might need to pay attention to? What are the other elements that we could kind of really pursue here? And that helped to lead us to the formation of the Alliance and the development of the Charter and the big mobilisation campaign, because it was that side of the change model where we felt we had some deficits, and there was lots going on in the transactional elements of change, but not so much in the transformational. So long-winded way of saying, absolutely, Jane, go for it. You can totally apply it now. And if you want to pick up anything offline with me directly, that's absolutely fine. My email is elaine.bayliss@nhs.net, which Rachel, I'm sure, will pop in the chat box any moment. Or we can collaborate through the network site, but go for it, I would say.
There we go. I hope that helps, Jane. Perhaps you can pop a comment in the chat box if you want to have a follow-up question, or if you have a comment to me on it. On sort of similar themes here, question from Mohammed Haji. How do you deal with people who are unwilling to change, do not recognise the need for change? The perennial question. What are your thoughts and experience on this one, chaps?
Okay, I have an answer, but I just wondered if Michael wants to go first on this one, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to put in my 2 pence. I think it's all about sort of using the tools that you've got out there for you to try and shift people's opinions on this thing. So somebody mentioned in the chat box that stories are a really powerful way of getting messages across, and I think it's about understanding what's going on and why things are happening, and trying to get stories from, you know, whoever your customers are, which are most likely patients or carers, and trying to get their feel of what the service is, and using that as a momentum to start that boulder for change moving. So it's just trying to chip away at it with little tiny things here and there, but trying to make people see that change can be done through powerful stories or understanding of processes or understanding a need that something has to change.
Absolutely. The Prochaska, Di Clementi and Norcross model introduced at the beginning that we like. It recognises this problem that people might not be aware of why they need to change, or might not feel motivated to want to do something about it, even if they do. So yeah, I think very useful session next week on how we might use stories to maybe fill that gap. And I think I've seen a lot of people talk about communication today, all of which I think can help. Elaine, you have some thoughts on this as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think both of you just did a grand job of answering that. I would just add to that, look to ourselves sometimes if we've got people who are seemingly unwilling to change. So is it something about how we're trying to sell what the changes we're seeking to achieve that isn't landing with those folk? And I would take people back to the sessions that we had in sessions 1 and session 2 for this webinar series about the need for framing and reframing. And I think Ali took us through one of her live examples where, you know, over a period of time she had to use 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different frames to get different people on board with the change she was seeking to achieve. So sometimes it can be in how we're delivering the message, and we may not have linked it back to the what's in it for me factor for the folks that we're trying to influence. So yeah, like Ian's just said, definitely listen in to Catherine's session next week on mobilisation. There'll be some great tips in there to help with that.
Okay, a similar-ish question. I'm hoping we've got time for a killer question coming up, but one before we do that. There's a question, do we have any resources that we can share to help get executive directors on board with the model? I mean, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer to it, but what do you think about that?
That's a very good question. I think we're going to have a little think about that one. So there isn't a ready, you know, executive directors pack thing, and there's not a thing. But what we have got is lots of fantastic examples of where it's been applied in practice. A bit like the wheelchairs program, and it's a real live example of how we went from a small base of trying to push change along to this mass mobilisation campaign, and then CCGs around the country actually physically doing something about it. And the strength of the success of that is the alliance was only meant to be a short-term 12-month alliance of folk to support that change effort. There was no money behind it. It was very much a coalition of the willing of folk that at the start of that journey actually haven't got great relationships with each other. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that despite getting to the end of those 12 months, the Alliance voted to continue as an alliance, and they are still going strong today, and they have now got to the point where next year it looks like we're going to get a change in legislation, so it's going to be enshrined in law the right to the right wheelchair for folk, and there's a whole bunch of work being done around personal budgets for wheelchair users. So it's carried on, that momentum has grown, and it started from us looking to the change model and say, right, how do we go about addressing the challenges for this particular area of concern? So yeah, we can take it offline, have a think about how we can support selling this to CEOs, definitely, and come back to you on that one.
It's a good one. And a comment from the floor, James suggesting on this topic to use of system drivers so the CEO can see the benefits for the organisation, which I think relates to your point about framing and reframing, seeing things from different individuals' perspectives and finding different ways to articulate and communicate our case for change for different audiences, perhaps. Also as well.
Can I just pick up on that point as well, because that's very insightful of Jane, because we had to do exactly that for another change programme where it just wasn't getting the attention it deserved from executive boards, and not because they didn't care, just because executive boards have so very many competing demands on their time. So some of the reframing that we did there was to think about what are the strategic imperatives for boards. So we related that change to, the prevention of harm and equality and impact assessment pieces. So making sure there was equity of provision, and it's about different ways to link that change to things that are on the priority list for chief execs and their boards.
Okay. I think one more comment from the chat box. It's kind of a question, and then we've got a couple of little things to do to wrap up before we close at 12:30. So Julie Riffy, if I pronounced that correctly, Julie has. I really want the change model plan. I want to try it this afternoon. No pressure. So I think she's asking how can Julie get that plan pretty much straight away to try out this afternoon. Can we help Julie to get hold of that plan? So obviously you've found at least one person who likes to look at that, Elaine.
Super. Yes, Julie, email me directly and I'll email you straight back with something.
Or yes, or you could share your email with us privately through the chat box to panelists or to Rachel, and we can send it through to you ASAP, hopefully. There's also, Rachel's popping some other resources into the chat box for you there. I think what is going into there at the moment is the link to the networks collaboration space. There's been a little bit of dialogue on there in the chat box about somebody having problems getting connected to that. I think, again, Rachel's offered to help very kindly. I hope not too many of you are having problems and that she's not swamped with help. But if you can go in there and create an account, as some of you have pointed out, you do have to click on the button to join the network space and we can approve you. And then once you are in, you should be able to find all of the resources that we are using on this program. That includes the recordings of the webinars today and the last 2 weeks and the future ones also. And all of the resources that we are mentioning on the sessions as well will be in there. If you can get on the space first, if you're still having problems, then that's great. Please do come back to us. We'll try and direct you to where that you can find the right stuff, including Sue, who seems to be having a problem. We'll see if we can pick that up with you offline. Apologies if it is causing you difficulties. So before we reach the half hour, what's coming next? I think we've mentioned this a little already. Next week, the 22nd, same time, 12:30 to 1:30 on Wednesday next week. We'll be looking at mobilising and organising, and we'll be joined by our Horizons team colleague, Catherine Pereira, who will take us through that session. I think that we've left it in a good place where it feels like this is the right next step with some of the questions that are coming up. So hopefully you will all be able to join us next week, and we look forward to connecting with you again. Many thanks, folks. I hope you have a great afternoon.